Welcome to the 5th annual Stockholm Security Conference. My name is Vincent Bulanin. I'm a senior researcher at CIPRI, and I lead CIPRI's work on the challenges posed by AI and autonomous systems and how these challenges can be mitigated through arms control and other type of governance measures. So the development of AI for military purposes is not inevitable. It's actually a choice, one that must be made with due consideration for the mitigation of risk. The big question is how this risk can be properly mitigated. So the topic that we have in front of us today is responsible AI innovation for international peace and security, an opportunity for international cooperation in the realm of arms control. Before introducing the distinguished panelists that we have with us today and who kindly accepted to join us, I would like to say a couple of words of background for our discussion. So artificial intelligence has an impact on military affairs in the same way it has on our day-to-day life. It provides opportunities, but also challenges. In the military context, AI could make basically any future military systems smarter, faster, and potentially more autonomous. But at the same time, the use of AI also generates some risk, notably humanitarian risk, but also strategic risk, as it could lead to lowering the threshold of arms conflict by exposing civilians and civilian objects to further harm, but also intensify state's sense of insecurity and the risk of crisis escalation. Some of this risk, CIPRI has done some work on that in the past, and I invite you to read the reports. And over the past 5 years, we have seen that this risk have emerged as a matter of key concern for the arms control community. And an important topic in this discussion is whether this risk can be adequately addressed and swiftly addressed by the standard tools of arms control, and if so, to what extent. And the ongoing deliberation on emerging technologies in the area of autonomous weapon systems within the framework of the UN Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons seems to indicate that attempts to develop an arms control response on the military use of AI will take time and will face a number of conceptual but also political challenges. So the discussion on autonomous weapons that started in 2014 with the aim to determine whether autonomous weapons should be specifically prohibited or regulated. And 7 years later, states still disagree on the definition of those, what risks they actually pose, and to what extent there's a need for a policy response. So as an arms control process on military use of AIs might raise similar type of disagreement and challenges. So in that context, there is perhaps a need for exploring complementary approaches. In 2018, the United Nations Secretary General identified responsible innovation of science and technology as a way to work with scientists, engineers, and industry in the mitigation of risk that are posed by new technologies, AI included. So the purpose of this very session is to kind of explore to what extent that multi-stakeholder approach, this idea of using responsible innovation as a form of technology governance, could help address the risks that result from the development, diffusion, but also use of AI technology. And this session is part of a project that CIPRI is conducting with the generous support of the German Federal Foreign Office, and would like to kind of kindly thank the German Foreign Office for the support that it has provided. And I also want to flag that we published a report on that topic no later than 2 weeks ago. Just to give you a brief overview of what we're going to discuss today, first we'll basically try to set the baseline and try to understand what is responsible innovation and how it can help achieve arms control objective. And also then we'll try to kind of explore how that could work in practice and what instruments can we use to actually implement such an approach. And finally, we'll also look into how this idea can be promoted by states, but also other actors. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our distinguished speakers. First of all, we have Raja Shatila, who is Professor Emeritus of Artificial Intelligence and Robotics and Ethics at Sorbonne University in Paris. What is particularly relevant for our discussion today is that you have been involved in a number of initiatives related to responsible AI. You have been part of the high-level expert panel that the EU convened on trustworthy AI. You also chaired the initiative, the IEEE, the global initiative of the IEEE on ethical consideration in AI, and you're also part of this, the new global partnership on AI. Next, we have Charles Vinck, who is working at the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs in New York, and you are specialized on the issue of responsible innovation. You're also looking more generally at the governance of emerging technologies, including autonomous weapons. And you are currently leading an initiative for UNODA on that very topic. Next, I have Alka Patel. You serve as the head of the AI ethics policy for the Department of Defense Joint Artificial Intelligence Center. And you, in this role, you are basically leading the effort of the DoD on responsible AI, and especially the operationalization of the DoD principles on AI that were adopted earlier this year. So thank you for being with us today. And finally, we have Eleanor Powles, who is senior researcher, a senior fellow for the Global Center on Cooperative Security. And we are really happy to have you here because you have a very unique perspective on the convergence of both AI with other type of dual-use technologies, including cybersecurity, but also biotechnologies like genomics and genome editing. And I think that would provide an interesting kind of cross-sector perspective on the topic. So just a couple of words about how this session will go, basically the rule of the game. So it's a moderated discussion. There will be a possibility for participants to raise questions using the Q&A function. So please submit your question. Given the fact that there's a large number of participants today, we might not be able to take all the questions, but we'll try to take them as they come in during the discussion, and we'll also keep a moment at the end for taking some questions. That's for the general introduction. Now let's dive in. So first of all, I would like to try to set the baseline and try to kind of get a sense of basically what is responsible innovation for some of us that might not be familiar with the topic. And first, I would like to turn to Raja Shatila, given the fact that you have, as I said, have been involved in several initiatives. I would like to ask you, how could you explain to us in very simple terms what responsible innovation is about? And perhaps a follow-up question could be, how come that so many initiatives on the topic have emerged in recent years? And perhaps you could say a few words about what this initiative typically aim to do and what do they have in common? Thank you, Raja.
Thank you very much for having me. Yes. So what we call responsible AI is something that wasn't born within AI. It's more within a movement which exists since some time ago, which is the responsible research and innovation. It applies to other technologies, of course. And it has taken a special meaning or blend in AI since AI became about 10 years ago, a very performant, able to achieve a technology that has been able to achieve things that it wasn't able to achieve before that time, because of the use of deep learning technologies mostly, and using data that was available, etc. So the fast development of these learning systems in AI has raised several questions, for example, about privacy, about the use of data, for example, about automated decision making, which is of great interest in our conversation today. And this is why, of course, the responsible research and innovation way of thinking was immediately drawn into looking on AI systems. And this, what is it? What is this process? This process is basically that we as designers, developers, researchers, engineers, stakeholders, I mean companies, governments, etc. When we develop a technology, being responsible is to reflect on the consequences, on the impact, on the possible impact of this technology. Of course, in theory, when you develop a technology, it's for good. It's for achieving some expected need or a service that increases progress and well-being. Not all the time, but that's a main motivation. But this technology might have a misuse or might have negative consequences. And if we don't consider this from the onset, it might be too late after some time to really correct this impact. Just to give an example, which doesn't have anything to do with the topic, take automobiles, cars, were developed in the beginning of the 20th century, and it was a great invention, of course, enabled to transform completely our society, actually worldwide, transportation, etc. But emissions are a consequence of this technology. It wasn't on purpose that people wanted to emit gases, right? But it was a consequence. And of course, you could have thought about it since the beginning, saying that, well, the impact is low. And actually, at the beginning, there was a kind of competition between automobiles with engines based on electricity or engines based on oil. But oil was cheaper, available, etc. So this was developed without taking into account the possible consequences. And now we are coping with this. And I hope it's not too late. So responsible innovation means that from the onset and over the whole process of development and deployment, the life cycle, you consider the impacts, you observe the impacts, and we try to mitigate the negative impacts, the risk. Eventually, this might lead to abandon the technology and adopt another one. And this, of course, has to involve all the stakeholders from the research phase, which might not be so much aware about the long-term consequences, but also when it goes into development, into deployment, into a framework for regulating the technology, for example. All this has to be taken into account. In a few words, this is what is responsible research and innovation. And for AI, of course, it involves all the possible impact of AI. So, for example, data, privacy, protection of personal data. It might involve, as I said, also the decision-making that is made by those systems. And as you know, those systems are very accurate, very performant. But then when they get something wrong, it's really wrong. It's not just inaccurate. So it's well known that, for example, learning systems using vision might completely miss what they are perceiving, what is in the image. It's not just, it's a probability to be closer to the correct result. It's completely something different. So it means if you use these systems, for example, for detecting tumors in medical imagery, they might be very accurate, but they might miss completely or see something that is a false alarm. So it needs human validation. Meaning that responsible AI here is also about discussing about the governance of AI-based systems to not only try to define what are the limits of the technology, but also define processes and requirements so that the technology is indeed in control. For example, one requirement is transparency. One requirement is accountability. One requirement is explainability, because these systems are known to be black boxes. So just to give a few examples, I don't want to be longer, but I think that's enough now. For now.
Thank you, Radha. I think it was a very good kind of introductory overview, and I think some of the point that you just mentioned about what are the kind of possible principles for responsible AI will be discussed later in our session. But just one follow-up question. So a lot of initiatives that do exist today on responsible AI, and the ones you're part of, for instance, tend to have a very civilian focus, and the issues related to kind of the military and use of AI is rarely discussed in an explicit way. How would you explain that?
Well, that's a very good question. I think there are many reasons. One of the reasons, for example, if you consider the high-level expert group on AI with the European Commission, well, it's not within the competence of the Commission to discuss about military issues. However, the high-level expert group has, in the report, we mentioned concerns about some issues, and automated weapons, autonomous weapons was one of those concerns. But of course, it's not in the mandate to discuss about this. If you consider the IEEE, which is an international scientific organization, the issue of autonomous weapon was discussed. Actually, there is in the first two versions of ethical aligned design, which is our output, there is a chapter on autonomous weapons with recommendations. In the final version, which was published in 2019, all this is on the web. This chapter wasn't felt to be mature enough to more officially express the opinion of the IEEE. So it wasn't in the final version, in the last version. In the GPI, the Global Partnership on AI, this is an initiative which is run by countries, actually, with the OECD. And again, the mandate is not specifically about military. There is one group out of the 5 groups focus on responsible AI. That's its full name is Responsible Development and Use of AI, which includes reflections on governance issues, but also AI for good applications within the UN SDGs. So autonomous weapons is not specifically part of this, but our mission in this group is to also come up with the recommendations about governance, and governance would include all areas, all domains. But also the reason why this is not so much discussed, of course it's a very sensitive issue, as you know, and governments, countries have a specific framework to discuss this, which is the meetings within the United Nations Convention on Conventional Weapons, and this is where it's happening also. So it's not happening elsewhere.
Thank you, Radha, and I think that's a good transition to the second part of the conversation, which is, I mean, the question of basically why and to what extent responsible innovation could be an opportunity for arms control and help serve arms control objective. And you highlighted the fact that there's already a discussion going on at the UN on autonomous weapons, and that currently seems to be the main forum where this is being discussed. But I would like now to turn to the other colleagues. First of all, I would like to turn to Al Capatel. So last February, the US Department of Defense adopted principle for the responsible military use of AI. It would be interesting to know what was the rationale for adopting such principles, why the DoD decided to adopt such principles, and why do you think it's relevant to talk about responsible AI in the military sector from your standpoint?
Sure. Thanks, Vincent. And thank you also for inviting me and having me here today. I'm really honored and privileged to be here with such an esteemed group of individuals. So I'm really excited about that. So to address your question, I should sort of maybe give a little bit of background. So the principles that were adopted in February of this year by the Department of Defense was not something that just happened overnight or over a couple months, but rather it was 2 years in the making. So back in 2018, the National Defense Strategy was issued, and in there was an acknowledgement of the changing global environment and the fact that there needed to be more investment in AI and autonomy. And so following the National Defense Strategy in 2018, the DoD issued its own AI strategy that supported that mandate. And within the DoD AI strategy, one of the 5 main pillars was focused on leading in military ethics and safety. And so around the same time the DoD AI strategy was issued, the Defense Innovation Board, which is an independent advisory committee, was asked to develop or consider AI ethics principles. And so they went on a 15-month journey. They did a 15-month study that was really robust, really inclusive, and really transparent. So included a lot of public forums, interviews, had individuals from all disciplines, so not necessarily just the technologists, not just the ethicists or the lawyers, but social scientists. They include civil society. And so it's really bringing all of those stakeholders and communities together to think about this as it related to the DoD. In the fall last year, I think it was like October, November, they issued their report and their findings where they had identified 5 AI ethics principles, which then really became the foundation and the guide for what was subsequently adopted as the DoD AI ethics principles in February by the Secretary of Defense. And so I just kind of wanted to paint that landscape that this was really something that was done over a course of a large time span, as well as very thoughtful in terms of individuals and expertise at the table to really think through this. I will say that the principles are really based when the DIB, the Defense Innovation Board, when the DIB put their report together and went through this process, it wasn't necessarily with the intent to start from scratch and think about AI separately, but rather what they did was take the construct of the existing legal and ethical frameworks that the Department of Defense already had, right? So the military has a long-standing history in terms of or frameworks in terms of like the law of war, humanitarian aspects, our own sort of legal frameworks in terms of reviews and so forth. And so they were really trying to build and layer on top of what already existed. And so with respect to AI in particular, and I think Rajan so eloquently has described, sort of the nuances that come with AI, when they were adopting these principles, it was really to take into consideration those nuances, as would anyone with any new emerging technology, right? And I think we probably saw a little bit of this back when cybersecurity, when we're thinking about cyber issues had come up, right? Like it was still nascent. We're kind of in that nascent period right now when we think about AI. And so how do we really think about this technology, build on existing frameworks that are in place, and foster the existing safety culture that the DoD is known for and really advocates for. So focusing on safety and precision for complex systems engineering processes. And so these principles were really meant to add on and supplement in regards to that and sort of, again, advocate and foster that culture while recognizing that AI obviously has the potential to bring benefits, but recognizing the need to also be aware and mitigate any of those unintended consequences or considerations that Raja was just talking about. And I think you had a second question, and the second question was, Vincent, that was related to, can you remind me again? I'm so sorry.
Basically, I mean, the rationale for adopting such principle, why is it relevant to adopt and promote such principles for the DoD and how that fits maybe to with the larger conversation on responsible AI.
Sure, right. So I think the rationale obviously was to address sort of the nuances and uniqueness with AI and building on the existing infrastructure and frameworks, and to advance the safety culture that is really critical given the mission of the DoD, right? In terms of why, I think you had also asked why it is important for militaries, the Defense Department to even be thinking about this. And I think I think there's a couple different reasons, and I should say, frankly, first of all, I'll state the obvious, right? It should be this should be something that all sectors and industries are thinking about, not just the military, right? I think that's sort of a given. I do think, though, also it's the right thing to do, right? We all have a responsibility to the extent of Raja, as he was stating, in terms of our individual responsibility and capacity as we think about these technologies. But again, thinking through sort of the mission critical aspects of the Defense Department and our mission around national security, I would stress one reason, for example, is really thinking about the trust factor. So the trust factor for the warfighter, the trust factor for the public, and the trust factor for entities that we want to collaborate with, from industry to academia to non-traditional partners to our allies, right? And so when we think about our warfighter, for example, on the field, when they have a split second to make a decision on whether or not to use that technology that's in their hands, they need to be able to trust it, right? We've heard stories about how the best technology is they've got folks or individuals or organizations might have the best technology, but if the people who are using it don't trust it, then what was it for, and for what outcome? And so I think from that perspective, we really need to engender that trust, and it comes in many different ways and forms for our warfighters. From the public perspective, I think that many individuals may not really understand how the military is using AI. And so I think there's sort of this transparency aspect that has to come into play, where we are open about how we're advancing responsible AI, how we're thinking about these technologies, how we're going to use these technologies. So there is sort of this public trust engendered. And I will say it's sort of a byproduct of that aspect too, is when we think about advancing these technologies and sort of advancing competitive advantage with militaries, the war for talent is real, right? We are all looking for talent. Of course, governments perhaps can't compete with those big salaries of these tech companies, but the mission that the military has in terms of national security, protecting its civilians and protecting its warfighters and its country is so strong. And so as we think about creating this transparency and trust with the public, it's also another way to sort of think about how do we actually pull in the talent that we need for the future of the organization. And then on the last piece, really thinking through how we collaborate. For us to do this right, and for us to advance this together, because we're all facing similar challenges, frankly, like it's in all of our interests to do this right. We need to collaborate with industry and academia and our allies. And so really, again, sort of being transparent around our efforts and sort of bridging a lot of these gaps of issues that have yet to be addressed is critical as we think about it from the military perspective. So, and the last thing I'll just say real quick before I stop here is I think one of the biggest challenges, frankly, as we talk about responsible AI and AI ethics is just having a common language and framework, right? And so one thing I'll just say is while we have the principles, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but while we have the DoD AI ethics principles, we also talk about those principles in the construct of the broader concept of responsible AI, right? So to me, a lot of those principles really are founded in good engineering practices, right? But there is a broader construct in which those principles have to sit and work in within an organization. And that's what we at the DoD are calling responsible AI. So thinking about organizational culture, thinking about operating structures, the governance aspect that Raja was talking about, thinking about incentive structures, thinking about all of those kind of things is the broader construct of responsible AI in which the principles are embedded. So I just wanted to lay that out. So as I provide further comments later on, you'll have the perspective of the lens that I'm coming from.
Thank you for signposting that, and I think you explained very clearly why, from a kind of the military standpoint, it makes sense to engage on responsible innovation, especially in the field of AI. Now I would like to turn to Charles. So we have heard that kind of like military view. I'd like to kind of change a bit the angle and try to kind of look at it more from a kind of arms control perspective. So I flagged in my opening remarks the fact that in 2018 the UN Secretary General made an explicit reference to responsible innovation as a way to mitigate the risk related to emerging technologies. So how do you see? I mean, in what way do you think the recent kind of explosion of, or like multiplication of responsible AI initiative could provide an opportunity to achieve arms control objective on
AI? Thanks very much, Vincent. I also want to thank the other panelists and all the audience in attendance. This has already been a really fascinating engagement. I'm sure it will continue to be. I've been following some of the questions that have come up in the Q&A already. Looking forward to get to those too. I should just give an initial little caveat, the standard UN one, that obviously I'm speaking in my personal capacity, so anything I say that may be frustrating or controversial, you can hold me personally responsible for instead of the UN writ large. Just to touch a little bit more on the Disarmament Agenda for anyone who's not familiar. So in 2018, the Secretary General published the first ever Disarmament Agenda. And the idea is that this is supposed to sort of unify the disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation work of the UN in general. There's never been one before. And as Vincent said, it has this direct approach to responsible innovation. And the reason it does that is basically for the same definitional reasons that Raja and Alka flagged. Any meaningful attempt at responsible innovation has to engage all stakeholders, and really, to be in any way effective, needs to start at the beginning. This needs to be something that's happening from the design phase, not something where much later we're sort of playing catch up and trying to regulate things that are already either in use or clearly very soon to become in use. So that's part of the reason the SG flags it like that. But that's also the reason that elsewhere in the Disarmament Agenda, the SG goes out of his way to make a big point that for responsible innovation, and really for any emerging technology issue at all, so like cyber that Alka flagged as a precursor, we need to make sure that we're engaging with all the different stakeholders. So that means engagement that isn't something that's happening purely at a member state to member state level or purely at an international organization level. It's something that is happening with developers, with private industry, with civil society, with academia, with everyone, because everyone has a stake in these. One thing I will also just quickly flag when we talk about the way that these initiatives can sort of support arms control objectives, and I do think they can, is that we need to be a little careful there what we mean when we say arms control objectives, because whose arms control objectives? That does vary a bit, and as I think came up a little bit earlier, but is something that also comes up quite a lot in the GGE on lethal autonomous weapon systems, is there are significant definitional disagreements between member states. So even within areas where it does seem like there's a broad consensus, it's not entirely clear that everyone agrees whether applications of AI will make implementation or compliance with international humanitarian law easier or inherently impossible or just more difficult, or whether we're really just talking about a verification and validation problem. So I do want to flag that quickly. But to get right to the question, I think there's really sort of four ways that this proliferation of responsible initiatives can support arms control. And the first one is just awareness raising in general. So as in the Office for Disarmament Affairs, our responsible innovation efforts focus on trying to build awareness in the developer community about the second and third order impacts of their choices, even in areas that don't seem to have immediate implications for disarmament and non-proliferation. And that's really building on the definition that Raja and then Alka flagged earlier. So there's assumptions inherent in that the developers can have that aren't necessarily problematic in every single instance, but they're not necessarily thinking about other instances that they can be used in. So assumptions about key variables can hold in one case, but not in another. So a mild example of that would be when I was based in Asia and the Pacific, I was working very briefly with a large American software development company. And one of their units that was machine learning focused in Japan had used the Japanese equivalent of a zip code as a kind of identifying variable. That's problematic a bit already in Japan, but it doesn't have quite the same implications as it does in the United States, where it becomes a much, much more problematic variable because of what it can signify. So in that case, it was fortunate because the ethical review board that the software company had caught that as a problematic variable and was able to move forward. So any effort, and having so many of these efforts, anything that raises awareness about what possible consequences could be is a positive development for arms control. So I think this also ties into the idea of these being complementary approaches. Secondary to that, it's this idea of getting ahead of specific problems. We fundamentally do have to play a little bit of catch up with any of these, any new technology, but especially AI when we're talking about arms control. But getting ahead of any problem is a huge advantage given you flagged how long the law's GGE has been in existence and where we are with it. We have the 11 guiding principles, but even with the 11 guiding principles, there isn't entirely agreement of what those guiding principles guide or what all of them mean. So there is a much greater acceptance, this is just one example, but there is a much greater acceptance of diffuse responsibility in industry than is really legally possible in disarmament and arms control at all. So these kinds of specific problems, they would clearly become fait accompli in the future if they just are allowed to develop on their own. If instead we have a large number of different initiatives trying to encourage responsible innovation, these things start to get flagged a little bit earlier. And I think that's inherently useful. So that works on both sides. That's not simply a problem of industry or simply a problem of civil society. That's a problem for all engagement with responsible use of AI at all, but especially from an arms control perspective, there's a real need to make sure that we're paying attention to these developments. And we ourselves are also thinking about what are the consequences of them. So these initiatives can help to make these kinds of issues more visible. And they also, in that sense, help to build up a kind of two-way street. And this is the thing that the SG is really talking about when he says we need to make sure we have proper engagement with all stakeholders. And that means we need to help to ensure that not only are tech practitioners more aware of arms control and peace and security implications of their work, but that we have to make sure that we as disarmament practitioners become much more aware of processes of development within industry or within development at all, so whether that's academia or other civil society, as well as becoming more aware of patterns of concerns generated within industry and at different levels. So I think we need to make sure that that is a meaningful two-way street, that that isn't something where periodically arms control of the United Nations or government brief or engage with industry, warn them vaguely about concerns, and we ourselves are not particularly aware of how development functions. So that needs to go both ways in an actually organic and ongoing sense. But also, I think for it to be truly effective, we need to make sure this is something where the links are happening at multiple different levels, that this isn't something where it's purely corporate engagement, where we might be talking to relatively senior levels of corporate development in major industry. It means we also need to be making sure that we're talking at the developer level and we're talking to people who are going to be practitioners but aren't practitioners yet. So at ODA, this is part of the reason that our responsible innovation outreach is primarily focused at STEM students. So there's a number of reasons for that, and I can get to that later. But a big part of it is just that that is a group that really isn't engaged in this dialogue at all, or to a very, very limited degree. At the same time, I actually would also want to flag that this is a really important reason to engage with entities like IEEE, because we need to make sure that that's a professional body. They're there, they're already working on this area. It would be a huge mistake to sort of ignore it or to go around it or to assume that only corporate level engagement is sufficient. At the same time, there are also implications that fall through the gaps between our different communities if we're not trying to build up this kind of communication. Black box concerns are ones that Raja raised earlier, but there are a few different complicating factors. So black box privacy concerns as it relates to GDPR and as that relates to national security implications for the use of data is all a sort of difficult gray area. That means it doesn't really get addressed in arms control, but it isn't really flagged anywhere else as a national security or a peace and security problem, but it is. At the same time, a really robust connection between the communities could help obviate that, and as well, maybe start to help some potentially normative elements, like the 11 guiding principles, start to inform thinking in industry and not purely be an area that member states or civil society are engaging in. I think an area that is maybe worth flagging as well, and builds a little bit on what Alka mentioned, is this idea that has come up frequently within the discussion around the laws GGE of sharing of good practices around weapons reviews. These Article 36 weapons reviews. There is an obligation for states to carry out weapons reviews. Not every state has the same capacity, any meaningful way to carry out weapons reviews. But every state will be exposed to militarization of AI should we, you made the good point earlier about that being to some degree a choice. Every state will be exposed to the concerns that come out of that, whether we're talking about the likelihood of increasing arms race scenarios or arms race dynamics in regions of the world that already lack confidence or maybe don't have quite the resources that it would make sense to be diverting to a really unproductive arms race. The final kind of point I do want to make is one that I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, Vincent, that I am slightly stealing from CIPRI, which there's this phrase about upstream arms control. I remember reading, and I really like that as an idea. And I think it does align with some of our thoughts at ODA, but I think it aligns a little bit with some of the thoughts that have already been expressed here too. And that's the idea that these initiatives and particular responsible approaches to AI can act as a kind of soft way to frame appropriate behavior. And that's not to dictate appropriate behavior, and I should be very clear, there are mandate issues around that, but to frame appropriate behavior in the development of AI in an appropriate good practice. I think in some ways, the international community has really been quite good at cohering around certain types of governance or regulation for new technologies. But it's definitely easier in the long term to be looking at responsible practices from the outset, instead of focusing on specific applications as they develop. So I think there's also other minor upshots, like the boom in initiatives clearly indicates a level of global interest in some kind of coherence coordination, even if it's not 100% clear what kind of coherence or coordination all the different stakeholders would find acceptable. At the same time, I've been a little bit surprised with some of the certainty I've heard from private sector representatives about their level of certainty that some kind of hard international regulation is coming as it relates to AI. And a lot of that engagement seems to be an attempt to sort of get ahead of that. And I think those are the kinds of things that we need to be more aware of and need to be communicating more clearly. Alka also flagged the problem we have there of speaking the same language in some of these areas. A really minor one is verification and validation, which mean very different things in arms control context and in an AI context, but are both fundamental problems for any actual use of a lethal autonomous weapon system, just for example. Just before I finish, I would like to flag, I do think an area where we're not necessarily, and by we, I mean the arms control community, but also industry stakeholders in general, are not necessarily doing a brilliant job of, is making sure that we have meaningful inclusion of Global South in these kinds of discussions. A problem with a few of the initiatives that you flagged in the plethora that have come through and a few of the principles that have been established is who are the stakeholders who get consulted. One of the relative strengths of the laws GGE is at least it is quite representative because of the nature of the Convention on Certain Types of Conventional Weapons as a forum, but it is an issue and it's one we need to move forward with. Abhishek at the Montreal AI Ethics Institute has written on this recently. And I think it's important to flag these issues of inclusion whenever we can. Obviously, there's a lot more to say, but I'm happy to leave it there.
Thanks, Charles, for this very comprehensive and overview of how responsible AI and efforts can support arms control efforts on the. Now, I'd like to turn to Eleanor, who has been waiting very patiently. So, I mean, you work at the intersection of the AI sector and as I flagged earlier on the biological sector or biotechnology sector. And I know that there's a lot of that has been done in the biotechnology sector in terms of like industry self-governance to limit risk related to the development or use of biotechnologies like gene editing. So in your view, what lessons do you think the AI sector could learn from the field of biotechnology in terms of like, especially making connection between perhaps like the issue of ethics, safety issues, but also like the larger kind of framework of like, you know, the possible implications of technological development for peace and security?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Vincent. Many thanks for this opportunity to share insights. So I was inspired by some of the concepts that were shared before, and especially in the last presentation by Charles. So fragmented responsibility through supply chains, need for foresight and upstream arms control. And so maybe I will just start by a very brief diagnosis that highlights defining similarities between the biotech and AI sectors, what we could call the 3 A's. So first, autonomy or automation. Under that impulse, the field of AI and biotech are both becoming globalized and decentralized sectors that are converging and developing at a rapid pace. And they are both also innately dual use. Second, abstraction, or what I call the in silico revolution. So the increase of intangible transfer of technology and know-how in both AI and the biotech sector creates specific challenges to the enforceability of controls. So it creates a need to adjust our non-proliferation architecture as well as the current prevention and enforcement toolkit. And third, adaptation. So there is currently a misalignment between those that are best placed to understand the risk of deliberate misuse of AI and biotech and those being asked to take action to prevent it. So take, for instance, DNA synthesis technology. So while it is governments that have specific resources to determine what biological materials and information they consider to be of most concern, it is the companies providing synthesis services that are left to screen them. So there is a pressing need to translate the taxonomic descriptions of biological agents subject to control into comparable sequences of concern based on genetic functions. And a similar effort is needed in the AI field, where engineers and policymakers need to learn from each other and agree on what AI functions. So what kind of functional augmentation we should be concerned about so that we can better align our arms control toolbox to intangible transfers of technology and know-how. And this is a good segue to what has been done in the biotech sector and what lessons could be learned by the AI sector. So first, I will start with an overarching and epistemic lesson. So it is critical to very clearly define what we're worried about when developing security and arms control regimes. And so, for instance, in biotech, we need to build screening and control systems that can address genetic functions as well as bioagents. Now, how does that translate into the AI field? It means we need to be concerned with the functional goals and the design principles prevailing in the development of algorithms, not just the resulting artifacts, so not just the algorithmic program. And we must also look for ways to improve our arms control and non-proliferation doctrine, for example, by reassessing core concepts like dual use. As the scope of AI research broadens, our definitions of dual use will change, and we need to continue moving towards functional definitions of activities that could become a source of concern. A second lesson: it is crucial to build incentives and capacity for the private sector and academia to participate in policy and non-proliferation screening. And I think that has been alluded to. So here are two examples from the biotech sector. First, the research on functional genomics supported by the US government. Those research programs are already designing deep learning systems to predict how genetic sequences are meant to function before being assembled, and even if the combination is not seen in nature. So the goal is to develop computational threat model that can be applied to characterize the function of novel combinations of DNA sequences. And the advantage of such an approach is that it can cover select agent control lists, but also build on decades of research into the factors that make pathogens dangerous. The second biotech example is about building capacity and incentive to prevent illicit gene synthesis, such as the common screening platform led by the International Gene Synthesis Consortium. So this initiative aims to create a common global screening platform to help prevent the accidental or intentional misuse of DNA synthesis technologies. And the advantages of such a global platform include allowing a common way to access and update screening algorithms as new threat factors are identified. So updating and knowing together. Second advantage, economies of scale make it affordable for existing DNA synthesis company to co-develop and maintain a state-of-the-art screening system. And finally, barriers to entry for new synthesis companies are lower while still maintaining security, as these new companies can take advantage of a universal screening capacity instead of developing their own proceeding without adequate know-how. The third lesson is to approach governance as an experiment. So communities of biotech practitioners need testbeds, sandboxes to experiment with policy approaches and to learn from each other in real time. And one example is IGM, the International Genetically Engineered Machine Competition, where thousands of students from many countries work on myriads of projects that can often expose policy gaps. And under the leadership of many experts, including my colleague Pierce Millett, the combination has become a catalyst to test approaches for managing dual-use technologies across many cases with opportunity for iteration. So for instance, IGM has showed the importance of adapting biosecurity regimes to the cycle adopted by bioengineers to design, build, and test organisms. And I think you might have a similar cycle in AI. The competition has also demonstrated the interest of a screening approach based on genomic functions. And finally, IGM illustrates the value of the technical and policy communities working together on testing and red teaming legacy biosecurity screening. So under that impulse, a reflection has started to emerge among young engineers and policymakers about how to identify at early stage and communicate about dual use potential under different models of openness. We talk a lot about transparency, but dual use and models of openness are also in tension. The fourth and final lesson is the need to promote a decentralized governance approach based on an ethos of responsible innovation. So codes of conduct, learning programs on security practices, DIY biosafety manuals, those exist, they are pretty thorough. Platforms for knowledge sharing, all these processes will be needed to help spur a form of normative leadership and to make it connect the dots across the fragmented ecosystems of the biosciences, from community labs, IGM, private sector, academia, ethics committees, and funding agencies. And I think we'll face similar challenges in the AI world. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleonore, and I think you paved the way really well to the other part of the conversation that I wanted to kind of frame was the question of implementation, and you already highlighted some key instruments that could be used for doing operationalizing responsible AI innovation, including the use of code of conduct, but also this idea of like we need to kind of like decentralize the governance approach and make sure that stakeholders in general have the ability to understand the risk and also like implement some measures, control measures at that level. So I would like perhaps to turn back. I mean, when we talk about operationalizing responsible innovation, there's two elements that I guess we need to think of is the idea of knowledge, knowing about the things that need to be taken into consideration to evaluate the possible negative outcome of a technological development, and having the means to actually like take action. So starting with the kind of the knowledge, and I would like to go back to the question of like the responsible AI principles that we have seen emerging in the past years, and especially the one that starting with the one that the DoD adopted this year. Alka, would you mind introducing for us the the 5 principles that the DoD adopted, and on what basis was the selection made?
Sure, happy to. And before I jump in, I just want to say really excited to hear Eleanor and Charles's comments. There's a lot in there that completely resonates, and so when we jump to the implementation conversation, really looking forward to the dialogue there. So in regards to the 5 DoD AI ethics principles, they are responsible, equitable, traceable, reliable, and governable. And I'm just going to take maybe 30 seconds on each one just to frame what each one means, because again, I think, when I say reliable, we might all have very different definitions of what reliable means. And this is part of the challenge of having principles and then ensuring that everyone is on the same page in terms of implementation. So when we talk about responsible, and it's really focused on us as individuals and the fact that all of us have a duty and are responsible in process. And so while I think this is time when people think about AI, they focus on developers or technologists. They're the ones making decisions. They're the technologists. They're the work, so it's their responsibility, and that's not true. It really is everyone's responsibility. And part of the things that we're looking at is the fact that we really should have integrated projects. And so it's the technology, the folks, the acquisition of everyone at the table. And so everyone will ask questions or on whether they might be or in terms of trying to identify what are potential consequences that might occur in the use case. Also, thinking about how everyone needs to care, and the fact that this is really forward-looking and proactive. This isn't sort of looking at we are laying someone our abilities so much in construct. This rather how can we be proactive and responsible in mitigating any risks that we might be able to foresee, and really being diligent about that process. Second principle, Governable, is about taking deliberate steps to minimize unintended bias. Feasible, there, it's the relevant personnel having the appropriate levels or appropriate understanding of the technology, processes, operational methods. Just that can be, again, this is but training and education is so important across the organization, again, right? And the
just to interrupt, there's a bit of a sound problem on it might be on your hand. I don't know whether you could maybe turn off the video for just a second, so we.
Okay, can you hear me better now?
Yes, much better.
Okay, apologies for that. So I'll just start with traceable. Hopefully the prior principle came through, but in regards to traceable, really you have the technology across the operational methods. And we talked about in the issue in how our trace is. And one of the things that we also are focusing on, in addition to everything we've already stated, is really how do we think about the knowledge of the development landscape, right? How do we ensure that the user really has an understanding how technology operates, as well as a relation with it, right? And so that's a critical piece of traceable, as well as considerations around transparent and auditable methods, data source methodologies, data sources, and design procedures, all sort of underpinned by documentation. So that we can go back at any point and try to trace when a specific decision was made, where there may have been a specific point of failure. All of this really speaks to really integrating and embedding into existing workflows and infrastructures. The next principle is reliable. And from that perspective, we are focused on making sure that there are explicitly well-defined uses for the technology, and really focusing again on safety, security, and effectiveness. So ensuring that these capabilities are subject to testing and assurance, and testing and assurance across the entire life cycle, frankly. And so really going to the fidelity of the technology with respect to that principle. And then the last one is governable, and that is really focused on are we able to detect and we have the ability to disengage or deactivate whenever there's some form of unintended or emergency, any kind of capacity there. And so we need to how we design and what that like, and I will sort of this principles has to happen at the very beginning of a. Let me just maybe if I come a little bit closer. Let's see. Is this a little bit better in terms of sound? Apologies for that.
So there's few moments where we're losing clarity. Perhaps you can try to kind of continue or just recap some of the last point in a very, very concise way. And if it's not working any better, we'll just put it on hold for a few minutes and turn to Reja. So, go ahead.
Sure. I'll try again here real quick. So the last two principles were reliable and governable. And in regards to those principles, thinking through reliability, and security and effectiveness of technology, will really be able to detect.
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, there's a bit of a sound issue. So what my colleagues can help you reconnect properly. I'd like, in the meantime, to turn now to Reja. So I mean, I guess you heard of the 5 DoD principles that were adopted. To what extent do you see an overlap between the principles set forth by the DoD and the ones that have been listed in the initiative you have been involved in? I'm thinking in particular of the EU AI high-level expert group. Whether you see like a kind of overlap between this type of principles.
Well, yes, a lot actually, and incidentally, we have studies, not only one, several studies that compare different initiatives, principles, etc., by several sources, and there are currently about 200 such declarations, initiatives, etc., and they overlap about 90% in their principles. Now, of course, each one has a different angle, and there are differences. And sometimes there is, of course, also a terminology issue because words don't mean the same thing for everyone. But if I focus, for example, on what the high-level expert group with the European Commission has proposed, there are 2 things that I want to mention. First, I would like to list what we have identified as 7 key requirements. So the word requirement is important because it's not just a principle, it's a requirement for AI systems. And specifically in the case of the European high-level expert group, it's about AI systems which would be deployed or developed in Europe, of course. And so those 7 requirements, now it will sometimes sound very similar. The first one is human agency and oversight, so human control in a way. Second is technical robustness and safety. Third, privacy and data governance. Fourth is transparency. Fifth is diversity, non-discrimination and fairness, addressing bias mainly. The 6th one is societal and environmental well-being. And the 7th one is accountability. So you see that there is, when you compare to what the DoD has identified, you have very similar things. Responsibility, there is equitable in the DoD principles, and we have fairness. Traceability, we have also the same things, explainability, traceability. We have reliability, which is in the high-level expert group about technical robustness and safety. And governable with the DoD is about all the responsibility, accountability issues. So you have quite an intersection in the principles. But of course, they don't match 100%. And since in the high-level expert group we are more focused on civilian applications or context, well, you have other topics. But the principles are not so far. But then you have to go a little bit further in the reflection on how to put these principles into operational principles, how to put them in practice. And this is where actually differences might arise. For example, we have defined in the high-level expert group something which is called the assessment list for trustworthy AI. For each requirement, there are a few questions that go into more details that are a kind of self-assessment that an AI developer or a company who wants to develop AI should address. And this is not something that you tick. You have to reflect on the answers and try to come up with an answer. And if you have missed, for example, some of the requirements in the assessment list, it means that your system actually doesn't really comply with what we call trustworthy AI. And again, trustworthiness mentioned by Alka is really key here. Trustworthiness means you can trust the technology, but it means also you can trust the governance framework that enabled this technology to be deployed. Again, to conclude, there are a lot of overlaps. Sometimes the word don't have the same meaning, but we have the same principles, if I may say so. And incidentally, I was in a meeting at some point with people from the US military, and the question was raised about, do you prefer a system that is accurate, or do you prefer a system that is explainable, that you can control? And the military answered, I prefer a system that is explainable, that I can control. I think that's really something that that can be appreciated.
Thanks. That's an interesting insight. So I'd like to, one of the issues I also wanted to kind of discuss was the idea of building capacity within the AI community about obviously like understanding the principles. That's one issue, but also understanding the kind of like the peace and security implications, or the second or third order of effect that Charles mentioned earlier. So I'd like to turn back to you, Charles, since I know that you are leading an initiative for the UNODA on responsible innovation. Perhaps you could share in very briefly, like maybe a few words about the methodology and that you're using in to kind of like try to raise awareness within the AI community about the negative implications of AI innovation, and maybe some takeaways from the work that you have done so far.
Yeah, sure. Actually, just building on Raja's story just then at the end. So trustworthiness is also something that is considered directly by the high-level panel on digital cooperation, 3C roundtables. So that's another UN effort. The high-level panel on digital cooperation includes stakeholders from everywhere. So civil society, private industry, the UN, member states, and so on. And that's a real area where trustworthiness does have peace and security implications, and work is already ongoing. In terms of the work that we're doing in responsible innovation, I will blitz through this answer as fast as I can, because I can see the time and there's some really interesting questions coming up, so you can get to those. Basically, it's as I flagged before. Given mandated areas, given the different approaches we can have to responsible innovation, for us, it makes the most sense to go right to the beginning. So we engage directly with STEM students. So STEM students are all in tertiary education, usually later undergraduate, early postgraduate. And at the moment, almost all of the pilots have been focused on Asia and the Pacific. There are a few reasons for that. Partially, it's because it's a high innovation region with relatively low confidence between states. Partially, it's because it's a region where that kind of thing doesn't come up as much in STEM education. I should be very clear, that's no criticism of academia in the region. Almost entirely, that's a lack of resources issue. So we engage with the STEM students who have no real background or no connection to disarmament. The first thing we do is explain why we're talking to them, because sometimes the fact that we're the Office for Disarmament Affairs can be a bit alienating or concern people. They don't want to get involved. So we explain where we are. We do some general kind of review of use case issues or ethical concerns or innovation problems. Some of the really simple ones will be things like, someone in the questions was talking about discrimination and bias earlier. We'll talk about the famous examples when you use Google Translate. So if you put in from a language that doesn't gender adjectives and translate it to a language that does, I can demonstrate in Chinese, French, and Spanish, and so on. It'll usually translate it in the most discriminatory possible way, usually in the most sexist possible way. And that's a problem of the data set. of course, it's relatively clear how the data set works. You have similar problems the other way, where if you do it to languages that have relatively little printed material, and you put in a nonsense sentence, you'll get a lot of very religious material coming back out because the data set is massively disproportionately Bibles, things like that. So those are some things we try and demonstrate to them as examples of consequences that are unintended. We then start to connect them to, well, what are the military, peace and security and other consequences of the same kind of mistakes or the same kind of assumptions? And in some of these cases, as with the Google Translate one, how would you even fix it? You need to be able to address that conceptually from the beginning. Then the meat of most of the exercises is something that we used to do in person with Post-it notes, but now, given COVID, we do digitally with Jamboards and virtual Post-it notes and so on, where we give them a bunch of use cases of technologies, and usually around one technological area that those students already focus on, most recently computer vision. And we ask them to rank them in terms of importance. We purposely don't define importance, we let them do that. The result is always the same. There's no consensus among the students. They have completely different definitions of importance, but more importantly, they have no even internally consistent hierarchy or framework of how they made their decisions. So one of them might choose something because they say, well, this one has huge economic impact, so it's number one. This one's number two because it might kill someone. This one's number 6 because it might kill loads of people, but I don't think it'll happen for 20 years. And we engage them on that and say, well, how did you develop a framework? How do you make that consistent? How do you make those choices? And we show them that even in relatively homogeneous groups, like these STEM students are from the same university, usually from the same country, studying the same thing, you don't have consensus amongst yourselves. You don't have the same definition. You don't even have the same assumptions. And they challenge each other on their assumptions. So we've been doing these quite successfully for a little bit more than a year, and are now building up to a much larger effort we should be doing with the Singapore Universities of Technology and Design, Nanyang Technological University, and National University of Singapore in March. The idea of this is, now that we've shown them how to start thinking outside of their domains, is we'll start demonstrating to them how to connect to people outside of their domains. So how to connect to expertise outside. We'll show them how they can connect directly to other people in STEM fields, but also how to connect to people who have a legal background, an anthropological background, a philosophical background, that kind of thing as well. So I think that covers the key points, and I do want to give enough space for us to keep going.
Thank you, Charles, for making an effort of brevity, given that I'm trying to have an eye on the time, and there's still a lot of questions I would like to kind of raise with you. So I would like to invite all the panelists to try to be as to the point as possible. I would like to go, I think the line is better now, Alka, so I'd like to turn going back to you. And so just this time trying to kind of focus more in the implementation of the DoD principles that you signposted before. So what are the tools that are already available for enabling stakeholders, at least in the DoD, to kind of engage on responsible development of AI? What do you think, like, what processes, practical process could be employed, and that would be my question.
On this one, please. So the way that we have sort of a framework that we look at in terms of implementation around responsible AI, and it's in the context of 4 Ps. So people, processes, partnerships, and policy. I'm just going to focus primarily on people and processes, and just a word on policy aspects, because I do want to, I think Eleanor eloquently said this, and it's something that we think a lot about in terms of like how we actually implement, and the approach that we're taking is a centralized alignment. Like we want to ensure that there's centralized alignment across the organization, but allowing for decentralized execution. So especially in the military, where we've got different services, we can't, from the DoD level, tell each service exactly step by step how to do it and expect them to do it that way, because they are structured different. They have different resources. They have different processes. And the part that we really focus on with responsible AI implementation is the fact that you have to embed and integrate into existing workflows, right? We don't want to sort of create these hurdles. This isn't a barrier. Ethics is an enabler. And so how can we really embed into existing workflows? And so we can provide the high-level guidance and alignment so we're all going in the same direction. But when it comes to some details of execution, it does need to happen on a decentralized basis. So when I talk about people for a second, focusing again on defining roles and responsibilities and training and education, what I've learned over the last couple of months is responsible AI literacy needs to be increased, right? We are not born as AI ethicists or thinking about responsible AI. And so it's a muscle memory that needs to be created. So how do we train our workforce? And so 2 quick efforts I'll just highlight is this summer I piloted a Responsible AI Champions program where we took 15 cross-functional individuals across the JAIC through a 9-week course where every week we were meeting and talking about each of the principles. And so we'd have a portion that was instructional and a portion that was a breakout. And so like, let's talk about this. What does this mean in your role? And the hope was that there would be understandings gained and they would go back to their own areas and also do peer-to-peer learning. There's also a larger workforce strategy as well. On the process, I'll just highlight real quick, really taking a systems approach, a systems thinking approach to this. So while we talk about tools and frameworks, they're great, but they need to be connected, right? Like we need to be thinking about it from end to end and not just sort of one random piece within a process. So from design, develop, deploy, and use, which are sort of the 4 high-level stages of the product lifecycle that we're using right now. How do we connect all the tools and frameworks and the assessments that need to occur from end to end? And how do we integrate and think about a risk management approach around that? And platforms, maybe using a infrastructure platform to really integrate and embed and automate some of these tools and aspects. And the last real quick example I'll just give is, and this actually does speak to partnerships actually a little bit, is as we think about our acquisition partners, how do we ensure sort of interoperability of principles in terms of expectations of processes? And so, we've started including our principles within our RFIs and RFPs, but more importantly, what does our evaluation and criteria need to look like? What do those metrics need to look like? How are we ensuring that the processes that our partners are utilizing are have the same fidelity as we would expect internally? So I'll just stop there for time.
That's your last point is very interesting in terms of like the interoperability of the kind of the implementation of the principles by different actors. So I think I'd like, perhaps we can come back to that point in a minute. Sure. I'd like now to turn to Eleanor again. Whether you wanted to kind of draw additional parallel with the biotechnology sector, and especially in terms of like some of the processes or mechanisms that could be emulated for in the case of AI, especially when we're talking about awareness raising or capacity building and or risk assessment processes.
Sure, thank you so much, Vincent. I mean, one that I will still raise, though I think it could be contentious and it should be something we should be thinking about in the future, but this notion of exploring different models of openness, and that's in tension with maybe the ideal of transparency that's being mentioned often. So as the dual-use nature of AI materialize, we need maybe to reassess norms and practices around the openness of research, for instance, with pre-publication risk assessment in technical areas of special concern. So should all types of AI research findings, especially when it's related to offense in cybersecurity or to adversarial machine learning, should it be subject to some kind of assessment that determine what level of openness is appropriate? This is increasingly being discussed in gain-of-function research within biotechnology. And so it could be useful to promote knowledge sharing across the AI and biotech sectors to learn from cases in gain-of-function research where we have tried to implement those forms of pre-publication risk assessment and to assess the opportunities and the limits of such a mechanism, because it's not so easy to implement it also in biotech. There is a lot of discussion and debates about this. Second, when I was talking about capacity building in technology and policy control, so I mentioned the role of IGSC, a global gene synthesis screening service that has several advantages. And one of them was economy of scale, making responsible gene synthesis affordable for smaller companies. The other advantage is it's an effort connecting industry leadership and public agencies' expertise in convergence, oversight, and standardization. And so how could that look like for the AI sector, right? What's the equivalent of a global gene synthesis platform for AI? And you're kind of thinking about, it's an interesting question, gene synthesis, what's the parallel in AI? Are we talking about data? Are we talking about specific features of algorithms? Are we talking about systems? And so, we could start thinking about customer screening guidance, and I think that's an interesting issue to deal with. So phase gate processes to ensure that sensitive dual-use AI technologies remain in the hands of legitimate, trusted customers and do not spread to organizations that fall outside of the scope of due diligence. But it's a screening only based on actors. And in AI, like in biotech, I think the game changer would also be to better understand augmented AI functions. So how do we do that? In the AI space, it could be a global public and private effort to screen essential aspects of safety, security, and functional design of algorithmic systems that are used in a myriad of innovation. And I think that's what Alka and Haja and Charles talked about to some extent. What I'm getting at is how do we deal with versatile augmented AI functions? So for example, I give you the example of residual neural networks that are used for speech recognition. They serve specific reasons, specific purposes in medical setting, but they also can lead to audio spoofing. And at the same time, they are useful for detecting audio spoofing. So that's really that example of augmenting functional potential with positive and potential for misuses. So how do we get better at screening and knowing that function? Then I would say a third mechanism, and I think I heard it in what Charles and Alka said, working with STEM students or with champions. Let's remember how IGM is serving as a catalyst to reflect on dual-use definition and to question the adequacy of biosecurity regimes to modern biotechnology. And so the same way, we could try to have a process of learning across communities and approaching AI governance as an experiment. And that could help with testing key AI properties, responsible disclosure of AI, and also red teaming. How would it look like? A little bit like IGM or like a work with champions. You would have a catalyst mechanism that could be funded and sponsored within academic and private sector competitions through global learning platforms like ICLR, or with the support and expertise of groups like IEEE. And so it should rely, I think, on a combination of formal and informal methods for educating AI engineers about responsible AI. What you see in the IGM community is really a bottom-up collective effort to learn together, publishing about what's being learned, and really iterating on good practices.
Thank you, Eleonore. So like for the last 10 minutes of our conversation, I would like to kind of like zoom out a bit and try to kind of discuss with you how we can, how we could promote responsible AI innovation further among states, but also with how to kind of like connect with the private sector and academia on the topic. And there were some questions raised in the chat that I would like to kind of bake in. So first of all, if we want to focus on the idea of like trying to promote the idea among states, I know that Alka Patel, the DoD has had an initiative where he reached out to a number of countries to talk about responsible AI in defense. So perhaps it would be interesting to hear a few words from you on that point. And I would like also to kind of maybe invite the others to also reflect on in their views on whether do you think it would be a useful prerequisite if states could agree on principles first about, for instance, the issue of meaningful human control, or what are unacceptable use of AI, or whether that we can have a process which is more bottom-up. So to what extent the states will need to agree first to structure the conversation about responsible AI. So Alka first, and then maybe I would like to invite the others to react.
Happy to share real briefly here. I think for all the reasons that have already been said, right? I think for interoperability, thinking about, especially from a defense perspective and national security, when the time comes, if and when the time comes and we need to be on the battlefield together with our allies and partners, we need to trust the technology, right? And we need to understand how that technology works and how it was built and sort of the whole traceability and transparency aspects. And so the AI Partnership for Defense, real briefly, was in the inaugural meeting was actually in September. Amy Culberson, who is our lead of international affairs at the JAIC. And so the point and the goal and our aim of pulling these countries together this initial set was really to think about how we can promote collectively the responsible design, development, deployment, and use of these technologies, and how can we coordinate and start collaborating on best practices in terms of what does responsible AI look like from a data collection perspective, a model looking at the model to ensure that there's no model drift, thinking about testing and evaluation, B&B, all of these aspects. How are we monitoring these technologies after they're deployed? And so how can we collectively get on the same page? Maybe or maybe not the same words in terms of principles, but at least let's talk about a level deeper in terms of processes. And how can we have that meaningful dialogue now? Because it has to start at the beginning, I think, as Charles has already alluded to. We can't wait after the technology is built, and I think Raja said this too, like we can't wait till after the technology is built and go back and try to reconfigure and redesign as we need to. And frankly, when time is of the essence, in those types of situations, we don't have the benefit of that. And so the earlier we start these conversations, advancing the shared values that we all have as we think about these technologies and collaborate together, the better the outcome. So I'll leave it at there and make sure there's time for others to weigh in.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to the others for maybe final remarks. On the one, in terms of like, basically what could we do to further promote responsible innovation for pursuing arms control objective, especially like among states, but also private sector and academia. Raja would like to go first, and then Charles, and then Eola.
Thank you very much. I'll be very brief. Actually, AI is a dual technology. And this has to be acknowledged, because what we do in the civilian framework has impact on the military framework, in my opinion. So agreements amongst states, international corporations, I think that's key, absolutely. But working within also the other the stakeholders, those who develop the technology, industry, and research, is also important. And there is a lot of, I would say, initiatives and agreements to develop a responsible AI in the civilian domain that will have impact on the military domain as well, in my opinion. So it's really a multifaceted approach that is needed.
Thank you, Raja. Charles, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I think Raja raises an obviously incredibly important point when we talk about dual or general use. So when we're talking about the militarization of AI or military uses, we're not purely talking about the weaponization of AI, though obviously from my office's perspective, that's the most important one. We're also talking about the implications for escalation, confidence between states of simply the military uses of civilian uses of AI. So you might talk about in logistics or so on. I do think one area that I do quickly want to flag, and we mentioned before, is that we really do need greater engagement between all the different stakeholders. And that is an onus on everyone. So that's an onus on the UN, member states, industry, and so on. So the CCW forum, where the laws GG is currently being carried out, is a relatively flexible one for that. It's relatively good at allowing CSO and private sector engagement, but there hasn't really been sustained engagement with and by industry, despite considerable efforts on both sides. So that is something we do need to work at, especially given that the high contracting parties to the CCW have all made clear as well the need for greater engagement directly with expertise. So I think that's something that we can obviously build on. When we talk about, I mentioned already the high-level panel on digital cooperation, the 3C roundtables and AI, but I think we can also take the step back that you were referring to and say, responsible AI and innovation are just good ways to engage with the private sector and build up that kind of two-way street. We need to be careful in that sense, though. You can see the behavior of Amazon and Google employees as it relates to military or DoD contracts is a relatively clear example that there's space, especially in the development community, to engage there. But the exact same example also shows how careful we need to be when we're treading in that area, because we don't want to be seen as an arms control community to be directly endorsing one use but not another, especially when there's no mandate to do that, or forbidding something that we have no space to do. Instead, especially as an arms control community, we can probably look much more at sharing good practices and stressing those and the international law and IHL requirements of use, especially for people who aren't accustomed to working with those. It's a relatively common problem so far, but it's something that we need to work to address. One last thing I do want to flag is I do think this is an area that civil society has been pretty effective on, and academia too. So earlier this year, I think in April, the Center for the Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge published its report, where it looked at arms control as a model of how to engage on verification. I think that's something that we could engage with much more directly. So I think it was a really important point that Eleanor raised about the different dual and general use constraints we've had before. This is an existing paradigm within arms control, and we've never had something quite like AI. But one of the things we should probably be doing is making sure we can say, you know, the MTCR exists, the Hague Code of Conduct exists. What are practices that we could be using, like the Center for Study of Existential Risk looked at, and how could we apply them? What are ones that don't work? What are ones we should change?
Thank you, Charles. Eleanor, briefly, I would like to give you a final opportunity to add to what the colleagues just said.
Thank you. Yeah, I would just add, you know, I'm a firm believer in the bottom-up approach, and I think that's a space where we need to invest also. So I would think of, you know, what we miss or what we need. Maybe it's a safe experimental space to approach governance as an experiment. So if we could have cross-field and cross-sector thinking on what I have tried to mention since the beginning, what this notion of functional augmentation by AI, having, you know, different communities of practice thinking about what it really means, and understand how it deploys into different innovation ecosystem, critical infrastructure. That's the systems thinking that was mentioned before. And you know, I remember also this mention of foresight. Well, that's where you would have that form of normative foresight, right? You think in advance, and you try to also think about how we operationalize ideal and aspirations, principles into practices that will actually sustain, you know, the reality of dual use and this versatility in practice. But we need to do that with the next generation, with the students, with, you know, those guys that are actually practicing, startups and others.
Thank you, Eleanor. So I think we are right on time. I will not try to kind of summarize all the fantastic points and ideas that have been highlighted here. We try to kind of, you know, understand what is responsible innovation, why it might be relevant to support arms control efforts on AI. There's a lot that we can learn from other sectors in terms of how outreach can be done toward academia and industry. We have also highlighted the importance of working from a bottom-up standpoint on this. So I invite all the participants to rewatch the session on YouTube when it's uploaded, if you want to catch up some of the points. I'd like to thank all the speakers for taking the time to be with us. It has been an incredibly insightful session, and I'm really grateful. And I hope that's the beginning of a you know, a more extended conversation on the topic. I think there's a lot that can be said, and there's a lot of questions in the chat that we have not had the time to kind of really address in detail. So I really hope that this is the beginning of a longer conversation. So thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.